I think my first client at the time was actually in Australia.
And this is
Uh,
pre-COVID.
oh yeah, I mean this was 2007 um,
2007. Okay.
when I
So
when I
you
quit
were
Adobe,
ready.
and I've worked full-time remote from home almost continuously since 2007.
When you were done with C++, I am assuming your interest in Java then brought you over to Adobe. And how were you able to, sort of leverage the information and the experiences you got there working with smart people, essentially coming to consensus, communicating with them, things like that nature, and then going into Adobe and sort of architecting and, managing large teams?
Yeah, it was definitely interesting. I mean, I went from sort of a small company that I was representing at the time to Macromedia first, which
Sorry.
was probably about, I don't know, 600 to 800 people when I joined, and grew to about 1,200 people. And it was the early aughts, so of course the dot-com bubble, and then the bubble burst. And so there were massive layoffs. It was, a strange time to be in the industry. But I'd gone into Macromedia in a very senior role, and I had a team of very smart architects working for me. And between us, we oversaw pretty much all of the large projects that happened in the IT side of the company. So I found myself sort of split between working with department heads, working with different divisional IT groups, and also sometimes working with the C-level folks. So, it was a very interesting mix of very high-level management, executive decision making, and also right down to getting your hands dirty with the engineers and working on things. We rolled out an MQ message system to try and integrate a lot of the diverse systems Macromedia had. And it was, so there were times when I had to roll up my sleeves and actually build some of the adapters for different divisions to connect that up. And other times I would just be managing the architects as they oversaw projects. It was a very, very good experience, and I really enjoyed Macromedia. It was a very free-thinking company. It was one of those where it was kind of okay to make mistakes and apologize afterwards. So there was a lot of innovation, and also at times not a lot of structure to how things were done. And then the acquisition by Adobe was a radical change for a lot of us. I'd gone from being at that point one of the oldest people in the division to being far from the oldest when Adobe acquired us. And at Macromedia, if you made your 5-year tenure, you got a watch. And if you made your 10-year tenure, you got a fully loaded MacBook, which was a really nice gift. And it was a big deal. They got like the whole sort of company together and thanked you for your service. And Adobe, it was common to find people who'd been there for 15, 20, even 25 years. So it was a very different culture. And they liked a lot of what Macromedia had in culture, which was partly why they acquired the company. But I think ultimately the DNA of the companies was very different. And I didn't enjoy my time with Adobe all that much, and I left after a year.
Okay.
And it's, I mean, while I was at Adobe, we did quite a lot of work on
Sorry,
some
a year
the
after
acquisition.
the acquisition. All right.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there was certainly some interesting work to be had. I mean, I ran a team that was working on core REST APIs that sat behind a lot of the document management systems that they were building out at the time. Things like Adobe Sign that you have now originated from the teams that I was working with back then. But it was such a change of culture and such a change in size of company. I mean, Adobe was 4 or 5 times bigger than Macromedia.
Mhm.
That it didn't really suit me.
Fair
Um,
enough.
and so I decided to quit and go freelance, and did a whole bunch of freelance web architecture and coding standard work after that all around the world.
So, so the journey so far is C++ standards, working
Mm-hmm.
with a startup, which was a very interesting sort of experience for you and sort of fit your style of intellectual discourse and creativity. Then the larger company comes in, acquires, and sort of, does what they do. And then
Yeah,
you decided to hop off the train completely and do freelancing, which is basically a way of doing a startup.
yeah.
So what ended up happening there? So did you travel anywhere sort of interesting,
I was
or was
fairly
it
fortunate
just,
that most of my clients let me work remotely.
yeah?
So, I think my first client at the time was actually in Australia.
And this is
Uh,
pre-COVID.
oh yeah, I mean this was 2007 um,
2007.
when
Okay,
I
so
when I
you
quit
were
Adobe,
ready.
and I've worked full time remote from home almost continuously since 2007.
Wow.
So I've had about 14 years of working remotely now. But yeah, I did I would help with sort of architectural design on large web apps, e-commerce systems. Reviews of code were very common. That was something I was engaged for a lot. And it was something I'd been doing back in England, back in the early days, that after I'd been working with compilers, I went to work for a company that did static source code analysis and coding standards. And so one of the things we would do is we'd go around the world, and that involved a lot of traveling, and analyze millions of lines of code in very, very large companies and highlight potential problems in the code and things like that. So I'd sort of gone back to that in a small scale way where I was advising on coding standards and architecture. And then a startup in the Bay Area engaged me initially to do that sort of work and then to actually do development and build up a team and create a new product for them. And that shifted me from, I'd gone from C++ to Java, and that shifted me to Groovy. And we built the front end with Flex, which was originally Macromedia technology and is now an Apache project. And that was a fascinating product. It was a desktop collaboration system that lets you share documents, chat, and do video. So this is back in 2007. And the tech was pretty rough around the edge, so it was kind of hard to get it working and kind of hard to get it to scale. And in the way of startups, one day the startup just imploded through lack of funds. And so the whole engineering team were pulled together and they said, really sorry, but tomorrow's your last day. And so I went back to freelancing again after that.
Well, it's better to try and fly too close to the sun and get burned than to not
Oh
fly
yeah,
at all.
yeah. And I think in the Bay Area, there's so many people who have that badge of honor of having worked for one or more startups that have imploded. Um, it wasn't it wasn't the first startup I'd worked at that had imploded, and it
Fair
wasn't actually
enough.
the last in the end.
Well, either way, it's a lot of fun to work at startups, but obviously, where risk comes, sometimes reward, not
Mm,
always.
yeah.
So you freelance, you join a few startups, I'm assuming. Then you ended up somehow stumbling into what you do now. You've been doing for the last 10 years, which is Clojure.
Yeah, and I was very lucky with that again because I got involved initially as a consultant because a friend of mine had engaged as a consultant with World Singles Networks, and he suggested me as an additional consultant. So that was how I got involved, and we were designing and building out the second generation of their dating platform. And it was actually all built in Cold Fusion. And partly I got involved with that because when we were at Macromedia, we acquired a layer, and that was the company that had created Cold Fusion. So we had Cold Fusion in-house running as a language on the JVM, a compile on demand language. So that kind of stayed there in my background for a while. But one of the first things I did when I joined World Singles was there was a particularly difficult problem um, that involved repeatedly scanning database, producing XML packets, feeding into a custom proprietary search engine, and running searches and generating emails off that, which needed to be a continuous process that doesn't fit Cold Fusion, which is much more web-based and request response based. And various people at the company had had a go at it in different tech, and they said, okay, you've got a free range to do pretty much what you want. And I was interested in Scala at the time. And this kind of goes back to my comment about learning a lot of languages at university, and then I've continued learning a lot of languages throughout my career.
Mhm.
And they said, sure, if you want to try Scala, go ahead. And so I built a version of the process in Scala, and it was a nice small program that ran very, very fast. And in fact, was able to bring down the search engine because it was able to generate so many searches concurrently. Uh, but at the time, this was Scala 2.7, the built-in actor library had memory leaks.
Okay.
And so the process ran, but had to be restarted every day or two. And that was fine. We could kind of live with that. And then we upgraded to Scala 2.8, which was horrendously painful. There was no binary compatibility between any of the milestone builds during the pre-release. It was just a nightmare. You basically had to upgrade all of your tool set at the same time, every time there was a new milestone build. And it didn't sit too well with some of the other engineers who were used to very dynamic languages. So I started to cast around for an alternative. And I'd done a bit of Lisp at university and saw that there was now a Lisp on the JVM, Clojure. And so I figured, well, let's try re-implementing the Scala process in Clojure. They're both functional languages, both support concurrency. And that actually went really well as a proof of concept. We got pretty good throughput, and it didn't need restarting due to memory leaks. So that was nice. And once I got that in place, the other engineers were curious about it. And so I started to cross-train them, and we started to write lots of small, low-level pieces of the system in Clojure, and gradually built up from that until the situation we're in now. We have 115,000 lines of Clojure. We have pretty much replaced all of the legacy code base we had before. And we've had a little turnover on the team, and essentially the back end are all Clojure engineers now.